Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive into the fascinating and, well, often surprising interconnections that shape our world.
Glad to be here.
Today, we're plunging into a truly extraordinary claim made by none other than Karl Marx back in 1867. It's a claim that might just turn your understanding of history, economics, and maybe even the very ground beneath your feet sort of on its head. Imagine, if you will, the devastating Great Famine that had swept through Ireland just 2 decades before he wrote this. Now, while many saw it as, a natural disaster, a simple crop failure.
A tragic accident of nature.
Exactly. Marx declared, and I'm quoting here, "The potato blight resulted from soil exhaustion. It was a product of English rule."
That's a powerful statement, isn't it? Really audacious.
It really is.
To link something that looks so natural like a plant disease, the blight hitting the potato crop directly to these complex societal and fundamentally colonial dynamics, it just immediately challenges that whole notion that the famine was merely, bad luck, an act of God, or just an agricultural mishap. Instead, it frames it as deeply human-made, a catastrophe rooted in power structures.
Absolutely. And that right there, that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to unpack this extraordinary claim. We'll explore Marx's deeply dialectical analysis of British colonization in 19th century Ireland.
And the goal isn't just to understand what happened.
No, exactly. It's about how, according to Marx, this colonial domination didn't just impact people and politics or, the economy in isolation. It actually thwarted the entire ensemble of social and material relationships within Ireland. Everything, even down to the very soil itself.
It's a profound idea, not just economic history, not just political history. It's about the ecological impact of power.
The ecological impact of power and how that power can quite literally colonize the land.
Yeah. So we'll journey through these different evolving phases of 19th century Irish colonialism. We'll try to reveal how these changing strategies of oppression directly impacted the land, the people cultivating it.
Cultivators.
And ultimately, how all this laid the actual material conditions for the Great Famine.
So get ready, everyone listening, to see the world through a lens of, surprising and often pretty chilling interconnections.
Definitely.
So, okay, let's unpack this idea of colonialism first. When many of us think about it, we often imagine like a static condition, right? A fixed state. Conquered, done.
Like a snapshot in time.
Yeah. But Marx, and this was really innovative for his time, he viewed colonialism in Ireland totally differently. Not static at all, but as an ever-evolving process of domination.
Constantly adapting.
Constantly adapting, morphing its strategies of oppression, finding new, sometimes really insidious ways to assert control and extract value. It wasn't just one big hammer blow. It was like this relentless strategic erosion.
And what's truly fascinating is how Marx details these changing forms of repression. It shows the colonizers' relentless adaptability.
Right.
So, for instance, in earlier periods, say 16th, 17th centuries, the attempts against the native Irish population were described as ethnic cleansing. Very similar, he notes, to the brutal campaigns against Red Indians in North America.
Direct displacement, eradication attempts.
Exactly. Direct efforts. But when those outright genocidal or, direct displacement efforts didn't fully succeed, when they couldn't completely pacify and empty the land, well, the colonizing power didn't just give up.
No, they innovated.
They innovated their methods of control, yes.
And that innovation led them, for example, to introducing a system of religious apartheid is really the only way to describe it. We're talking specifically about the Protestant penal laws.
Yes, the penal laws.
Now, these weren't just about religious intolerance, though that was part of it. They were a calculated, strategic legal mechanism. These laws specifically made Anglicanism a proprietary title.
Meaning your religion determined your right to own property.
Exactly. It directly linked religious affiliation to land ownership, political power, social standing. If you were Catholic, and the vast majority of the Irish population was Catholic, you couldn't hold public office, you couldn't own land outright in most cases, you couldn't inherit easily, you couldn't even vote for a period.
It was incredibly comprehensive.
It was a sophisticated legal framework designed specifically to dispossess the Irish of their lands and systematically deny them any pathway to economic or political agency. It basically forced a choice: conform, convert, or be rendered landless and powerless.
And this illustrates a critical point Marx was making. Despite these shifting concrete forms of repression moving from, outright violence to legal discrimination, religious, economic pressure,
The methods changed.
the methods changed, but the essential underlying process of colonial domination continued. The tools got maybe more insidious, more bureaucratic, but the fundamental objective, control, extraction, suppressing Irish self-determination, that remained constant.
Like a predator changing its hunting technique, as you said. But the goal's the same.
Precisely.
Okay, so that's the evolving nature of the colonial process. But what did this mean for what Marx called the Irish organic totality? That's quite a phrase.
It is. And his analysis was incredibly broad here. He wasn't just focused on the economy, which maybe some more traditional Marxist interpretations might stick to.
Right.
Instead, he argued that the entire ensemble of social and material relationships within the Irish organic totality was thwarted, blocked, subverted.
So if you think of Ireland as like a living organism.
Exactly. Every single part of it, its political system, its economic structures, its culture, its laws, its social fabric, and crucially for our discussion today, its ecological systems, all of it was systematically undermined by this colonial project.
England didn't just conquer Ireland. It fundamentally twisted its very fabric, distorted its natural development path.
To put it bluntly, yes. Marx put this very powerfully. He stated, England has subverted the conditions of Irish society. He breaks it down. At first, it confiscated the land, then it suppressed the industry by parliamentary enactments, and lastly, it broke the active energy by armed force.
A three-pronged attack, almost.
Essentially. And thus, he concludes, England created those abominable conditions of society which enable a small caste of rapacious lordlings to dictate to the Irish people the terms on which they shall be allowed to hold the land and live upon it.
Wow. That lays bare the systematic nature of it. It wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, strategic assault designed to create a dependent, exploitable population.
And this leads us right to that surprising, maybe even chilling concept, the colonization of soil.
Right. What do you mean by that exactly?
Well, Marx asserted it wasn't just about agricultural commodities being taken away, the material stuff, sacks of grain, herds of cattle shipped off to England, though that happened, of course. He argued that the actual production process itself, the ability to create those commodities sustainably, was impeded by colonialism.
So it's not just taking the apples, it's deliberately damaging the tree, preventing it from bearing fruit properly, maybe even poisoning the ground it grows in.
That's a great analogy. Yes, it's about crippling the productive capacity at its source.
And this is where we really get into the ecological heart of Marx's argument, isn't it? It connects to that concept of the metabolic rift.
Exactly, the metabolic rift. Now, this term, which has been really developed extensively by scholars like John Bellamy Foster, building on Marx's work.
Yeah.
It originally describes the depletion of soil nutrients, things like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, the essential building blocks for plants.
Right. Things crops take out of the soil.
Precisely. This depletion happens when crops and animal products are removed from the fields and shipped off, usually to distant urban centers. Think of it as a broken natural cycle. Well, traditionally, in many agricultural systems, waste products, manure, human waste, crop residues would eventually return nutrients to the land they came from, maintaining fertility over time.
A closed loop, sort of.
Kind of. But with the rise of large industrial cities, food traveled long distances to feed urban populations. And the waste from those populations, instead of going back to the fields, often ended up polluting rivers or being disposed of elsewhere.
Creating a break in the cycle, a rift.
Exactly. A rift in the metabolism, the natural exchange between human society and the soil. And the result: widespread soil exhaustion in the agricultural areas supplying those cities.
Okay, so that's the general idea of the metabolic rift. But how did Marx apply this specifically and maybe differently to Ireland?
Right, because here's where it gets really interesting and frankly quite devastating in the Irish context. Marx expanded this concept. He showed that in Ireland, the metabolic rift wasn't just about the physical distance, the transportation of nutrients corn from Irish fields to London tables, although that absolutely happened.
There was more to it.
Much more. Crucially, Marx argued it was the social relations of production, the specific way society was organized around land ownership, rent, and labor that actively prevented the cultivators, the actual farmers, from replacing those lost nutrients.
So it wasn't just that the nutrients left. It's that the people working the land were actively stopped from putting anything back.
Precisely. It was a social and political barrier to ecological sustainability, not just a geographical one.
He put it quite starkly, didn't he?
He did, Marx stated. It must not be forgotten that for a century and a half, England has indirectly exported the soil of Ireland without even allowing its cultivators the means for replacing the constituents of the exhausted soil.
Wow. Exported the soil.
Exported the soil. And this highlights two critical consequences that come from Marx's expansion of the metabolic rift idea. First, the cultivators could theoretically mend the rift. They had the knowledge, the potential ability.
If things were different.
If social conditions were appropriate, if they had secure tenure, fair rents, maybe some capital, the incentive to invest, they could have returned nutrients and maintained fertility. They knew how. But second, and this is the crux of it, they were fundamentally prevented from doing so by a dominant class.
The landlords.
The land monopolists, the landlords, yes. They exploited the tillers of the soil so ruthlessly through mechanisms like rackrenting that it just thwarted their ability to maintain soil fertility. They were basically draining both the lifeblood of the people and the lifeblood of the land at the same time.
This sounds less like simple economic exploitation and much more like a simultaneous, like a war being fought on multiple fronts, all interconnected.
That's a very good way to put it. Marx really illustrates this as a comprehensive struggle.
So what were these fronts?
Well, first you had the overarching colonial struggle, right? The colonizing regime, Great Britain, against the colonized civil society of Ireland, a battle for political autonomy, national identity, often met with force and legal suppression.
Okay, the political front.
Second, there was that deeply entrenched economic struggle. The landlords' overwhelmingly Anglo-Irish or English absentee owners versus their rack-rented tenantry. A direct class conflict over land, produce, surplus value, with rents pushed to unbearable levels.
The economic front. Exploitation.
Exactly. And then the third front. The one that often gets overlooked in standard histories, but which Marx brings into sharp focus. The ecological struggle.
The struggle over the soil itself.
Yes. This was the silent, often brutal war between the soil cultivators, the Irish peasants and cottiers doing the actual physical work, and the owners of the soil, who prioritized short-term extraction and profit over the land's long-term health and sustainability.
The landlords just didn't care about the future of the soil.
Their focus was maximizing rent now. The long-term health of the resource their wealth ultimately depended on was secondary at best. It was this insidious intertwining of colonial, economic, and ecological exploitation that didn't just contribute to, but actually laid the very material conditions for the Great Famine. The ground was literally prepared for catastrophe.
Okay, let's dive into that pre-famine era then, roughly 1801 to 1846. This period Marx described as being dominated by the rack-renting machine.
Right.
But to really set the scene, we need to grasp the impact of the Act of Union of 1801. You mentioned parliamentary enactments earlier. This seems key.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. The Act of Union, while framed as a political merger, had immediate and catastrophic economic consequences for Ireland's developing industries.
How so?
It effectively imposed free trade between Ireland and a much, much more industrially advanced Britain. Irish manufacturers simply couldn't compete with the flood of cheaper, mass-produced goods coming from Britain.
They were just wiped out.
Pretty much. They withered and died. As Marx vividly put it, every time Ireland was about to develop industrially, she was crushed and reconverted into a purely agricultural land.
So it wasn't just market forces, it felt deliberate.
Marx certainly portrayed it as a deliberate policy outcome, systematically preventing Ireland from diversifying its economy, which in turn forced its growing population back onto the land for sheer survival.
And the consequence of this forced deindustrialization, it sounds grim.
It was stark, horrifying, really. A massive demographic concentration in rural areas. With no other real economic options, for the vast majority of Irish people, land is life became this agonizingly literal reality.
The choice was?
The choice was brutal. The occupation of land at any rent or starvation, that level of desperation created the perfect conditions for a truly exploitative system to flourish.
The rack-renting system.
Exactly, rack renting. Marx didn't just mean high rent, he defined it as a super exploitative rent relationship. While it often involved money changing hands, its nature was fundamentally feudal in its rapaciousness.
Was the main way wealth was extracted.
It became the motor of accumulation for the landlord class, driving immense wealth out of Ireland into the hands of a relatively small elite. And crucially, Marx distinguished this from typical capitalist ground rent you might find elsewhere.
How was it different?
Well, in a developed capital system, rent might be, say, an excess profit above the average return. But in Ireland, Marx argued, rent was often a deduction from his necessary wage.
Hey.
Meaning the rent was so high it pushed the peasant's income below what was needed for basic survival. Imagine working all year, producing food, only to pay so much rent you couldn't afford to feed your own family properly. That was the stark reality for millions.
So these landlords held a complete monopoly, not just of ownership, but of access to life itself, essentially.
Pretty much, access to a livelihood. And the most pivotal, the most crushing element of this whole system was the insecurity of tenure.
Tenants could be kicked out easily.
Very easily. Most were tenants at will, and they faced this truly agonizing dilemma, a vicious catch-22.
Which was?
If they invested their own meager resources, their time, their sweat, their labor in improving the land, maybe draining a waterlogged patch, building a stone wall, adding manure to enrich the soil.
Things that would make the land more productive.
Exactly. But if they did that, their rent would almost certainly be increased by the landlord or his agent. Their own effort, their own capital was immediately appropriated.
So they were penalized for improving things.
Penalized for improving. But if they resisted the rent increase or just couldn't pay it, they faced unceremonious, often brutal eviction, Marx noted starkly. If the tenant concedes to pay the rent increase, he has to pay the interest for his own money to the landlord. If he resists, he will be very unceremoniously ejected.
It just removes any incentive for long-term thinking, for sustainability, for building anything lasting.
Completely. Why improve the land if it just makes you poorer or gets you thrown off it?
And it got even worse. There were middlemen involved.
Oh, yes. This already dire system was complicated further by this parasitic layer of intermediary landlords, often just called middlemen.
Who were them?
These were often larger tenants who leased big tracts of land from the primary landowners, the Anglo-Irish gentry or absentee English lords. But then they'd ruthlessly sublet smaller plots, sometimes multiple times over, layer upon layer, to the actual cottiers and small peasants.
Adding more layers of rent extraction.
Exactly. Marx noted they would relet holdings for 5 times their value, adding another, often even more ruthless, layer of exploitation. Imagine trying to survive on a tiny plot, and you have to pay rent not just to the ultimate owner miles away, but also to 2 or 3 intermediaries above you, each taking their cut.
It just compounds the burden exponentially.
It reduced the actual producers, the families doing the back-breaking work, to what Marx called a state of popular starvation. Caught in a vice, every scrap squeezed out, leaving barely enough to survive, let alone think about the soil's health.
And British policy, you mentioned the Corn Laws earlier, played a role in locking the system in place.
A crucial role. The English Corn Laws of 1815. These laws artificially secured Ireland's monopoly for freely importing corn into Great Britain.
Which sounds like it could be good. A guaranteed market.
On the surface, maybe. But in reality, it locked Ireland into being Britain's dependent granary. It geared Ireland's entire agricultural sector towards exporting basic grains, preventing diversification, and making the island totally subservient to British food demands, not its own people's needs.
And the scale of this export was huge.
Massive. Marx cites the figures. Average grain export from Ireland went from about 300,000 quarters a year just after 1801 to a staggering 2.5 million quarters by 1834.
Food literally flowing out of a country where people were on the edge of starvation.
Precisely. But it wasn't just grain leaving. An astonishing £7 million sterling, that's rent, interest payments, investment funds, was sent annually from Ireland to the UK.
£7 million a year.
A huge sum back then. Marx observed with chilling clarity that Ireland was, quote, forced to contribute cheap labor through emigration and cheap capital to building up the great works of Britain. Ireland was financing Britain's industrial revolution while its own people starved and its land was stripped bare.
So the Irish peasantry, caught in this impossible situation, reduced to subsisting almost entirely on potatoes, just one crop, incredibly vulnerable.
Dangerously reliant on a monoculture?
And their means of production, the soil itself, reduced to minimal sustainability. Any investment in improvements, any long-term care was just too risky.
Right. Why drain a field or add lime if it meant higher rent or eviction? So peasants could really only maintain productivity, mostly through sheer hard labor and incredibly meticulous, desperate manuring efforts.
And this brings us to the cottiers, right? The unsung heroes in Marx's ecological analysis.
Absolutely. The cottier class. These weren't wage laborers like in England. Their whole life depended on getting access to a tiny plot of land, usually just to grow potatoes.
Their food source.
Their main, often only food source. And Marx noted with real insight that under Cornacre, the farmer in great measure trusted to his laborers to manure the land for them.
Wait, what does cornacre mean here, and how did they manure the farmer's land?
Ah, okay. Conacher, sometimes called Cornacre, was this specific, often annual rental contract. It was usually between a tenant farmer who held a larger plot and these cottier laborers. The cottiers got access to a small plot, maybe half an acre, specifically to grow their potatoes. They paid rent for this plot, but often not in cash. Very often, the rent was paid through their labor on the tenant farmer's other fields, the grain fields usually.
So they worked off the rent for their potato patch.
Exactly. But the crucial part ecologically is that this system forced them to intensively manure their own small potato plot because their survival depended on getting the maximum yield from that tiny piece of land. And often the tenant farmer would allocate the most exhausted parts of his holding for Conacher.
Knowing the cottier would have to work like mad to make it fertile enough for potatoes.
Precisely. It was a way for the tenant farmer to get his worst land manured for free, essentially. The cottier's struggle for survival directly benefited the tenant farmer's land fertility, but at immense cost to the cottier.
So the cottiers were gathering manure, but where were they getting it from?
This led to incredible, almost unbelievable acts of cottier ingenuity or maybe desperation. They were constantly scouring their surroundings for any source of fertility. Extra economic efforts, Marx called them.
Like what?
Gathering turf mold from bogs, scraping manure and dirt off the roads. Road scrapings were valuable. Meticulously collecting every scrap of pig manure. Often they kept the family pig inside the cabin with them to make sure none was lost.
Living with their animals.
Yes, they'd haul seaweed up from the coast if they were near it, collect shells, sometimes even gravels to break up heavy soil. And a really intensive practice was paring and burning.
What's that?
They'd strip off the top layer of turf or sod, burn it carefully, and spread the ash. It releases nutrients quickly, giving a temporary boost to the soil, but it's very labor-intensive and not sustainable long-term. It was just this constant, ceaseless struggle against exhaustion, both their own and the soil's.
And their main tool in this fight was spade cultivation. Lazy beds.
Spade husbandry, yes, particularly the method known as lazy beds. This was their main weapon, as Marx put it, against the soil squandering its vitality. And it was extraordinarily hard work.
How did it work?
It involved deep digging with a spade, often the only tool they had, systematically turning and pulverizing the soil, mixing topsoil with subsoil. Sometimes they even had to break through a hard layer called the iron pan.
Iron pan.
Yeah, it's a compacted layer that can form below the topsoil in some conditions. It stops water draining and locks up nutrients. Breaking it was back-breaking work, but essential to release fertility.
And they did more than just deep digging.
Yes, there was also more superficial cultivation, what Marx called skimming the first cream, turning over the sods with their surface vegetation to get at the richer soil underneath. And potato cultivation itself is intensive. You dig deep to plant, then you have to repeatedly mound soil up around the growing plant, earthing up. All this further pulverized the soil, releasing minerals.
But there was a terrible paradox here, wasn't there?
A profound and tragic one. While this incredibly intensive spade work was absolutely critical for keeping the soil productive, for literally resuscitating it year after year, this very method, concentrating cultivation in these deep mounded rows,
Made it easier for disease to spread.
exactly. It intensified the ability of a disease, such as blight, to spread rapidly through the closely packed plants in those fertile, moist beds. The potato crop and the way it had to be grown to survive was both necessary for the soil under this system and tragically made it incredibly vulnerable, a perfect storm waiting to happen.
It's just this vicious cycle. Human struggle, ecological struggle, and class struggle all tangled together.
Absolutely. The cottier wasn't just fighting nature. They were locked in this constant, often brutal class struggle with the tenant farmers who were trying to extract maximum labor and fertility from them, often by giving them the most exhausted plots to begin with.
Making them work even harder just to survive.
Further entrenching the whole cycle of exploitation and environmental damage. It's a grim picture leading up to 1846.
Okay, so the famine hits. Around 1846, the potato blight arrives. This becomes the absolute watershed moment.
The defining catastrophe, yes. What started as a crop failure quickly moved from being a partial issue to a general famine engulfing the country. And for Marx, this wasn't just bad luck. It indicated a deep structural propensity for this kind of disaster within that colonial system.
He saw the blight as the trigger then. the thing that exposed the existing weakness.
Exactly, the catalyst. He acknowledged that the immediate reaction, mass flight, emigration, starvation, leading to what he called a revolution of the old agricultural system, was initially a devastating but almost natural outcome of the crisis. People died or fled, farms were abandoned or consolidated, there was a shift towards livestock.
But it didn't stay natural for long.
No. Marx argued this initial chaotic revolution quickly became a conscious and deliberate system. The landlords, and crucially the English legislature backing them up, deliberately made the most of the famine.
Leveraged the crisis.
Leveraged the crisis to forcibly carry out the agricultural revolution they wanted, clearing the land of small tenants, and, quite chillingly, to thin the population of Ireland down to a level they found more economically convenient.
Using human suffering as a tool for policy.
It was an opportunistic acceleration of pre-existing colonial goals. Truly brutal.
And Marx identified specific drivers that turned this from a tragedy into a systematic clearance.
Yes, he meticulously outlines 4 key drivers. The first, ironically, was the repeal of the Corn Laws in Britain in 1846.
Repealing the very laws that had made Ireland Britain's granary.
Precisely. It was partly a response to the Irish disaster, but the effect in Ireland was catastrophic. Irish corn immediately lost its protected status, its monopoly on the English market. Prices plummeted.
Making it impossible for tenants to pay rents based on growing corn.
Exactly. But here's the crucial economic contrast Marx highlights. While corn prices crashed, the prices for meat, wool, and other animal products had been steadily increasing for about 20 years.
Creating a huge incentive to switch from tillage to pasture.
A powerful, almost irresistible economic pull for landlords. Pasture required far fewer tenants, far less labor. So Ireland faced this double loss. Marx said it was deprived of the English market now as by the act of the union of her own. Her main export crop became unprofitable, and her own industrial potential had already been crushed.
Okay, so that's driver 1. Corn law repeal pushing towards pasture. What was second?
The second was this radical agricultural reorganization, which Marx bitterly called a caricature of what was happening in England at the time.
A caricature? How?
Well, in England, the agricultural revolution involved sophisticated improvements, integrating green crops like clover and turnips as fodder for animals, which actually improved the soil and removed the need for leaving land fallow. This was combined with huge capital investments in drainage, building stalls for animals to collect manure efficiently, new machinery, using imported mineral manures like guano. It was about boosting productivity sustainably.
And in Ireland?
In Ireland, it was the caricature. Yes, there was a shift to permanent pasture, but it was done without the green crops. And crucially, without any significant capital investment in permanent improvements. Land was just laid down as permanent grassland. Based altogether on unassisted nature, Marx said.
So, no investment in drainage, soil health, anything.
Very little. Which meant the soil, already exhausted, just continued to degrade. Soil exhaustion reemerged rapidly because those vital recuperative green crops and essential improvements were missing. It wasn't development. It was more like agricultural abandonment, designed for low-cost extraction, not long-term health.
Grim. What was the third driver?
The third was parliamentary legislation, the Irish Poor Law Extension Act of 1847.
A law to help the poor.
Ironically, yes, that was the stated aim. But it placed the financial burden of supporting Irish paupers directly onto the Irish landlords themselves through local property taxes or rates.
So if a landlord had lots of poor tenants on their land,
they had to pay higher rates to support them. Perverse as it sounds, this created a powerful financial incentive for landlords to try to get rid of the people and clear their estates simply to avoid paying the poor rates.
So the law designed to help the poor actually incentivized evicting them.
That was its practical effect. It led to a sharp, horrific rise in evictions, peaking at an unbelievable 100,000 people evicted in 1850 alone.
100,000 people in 1 year.
Staggering. And many were illegally evicted or, tragically, felt forced to voluntarily surrender their tiny holdings just to qualify for any relief under the incredibly harsh quarter-acre clause.
The quarter-acre clause, what was that?
Another piece of brutal bureaucracy. It stipulated that if you occupied more than a quarter of an acre of land, you were disqualified from receiving any poor relief, no matter how destitute or starving you were.
So, to avoid starving to death, families were forced to give up their only means of future subsistence, their tiny plot of land.
Exactly, ensuring they became utterly destitute, dependent, and homeless. It effectively weaponized Honer to achieve the landlord's goal of clearing the estates. A calculated cruelty.
Unbelievable. And the fourth driver?
The fourth was the Encumbered Estates Act of 1853.
Encumbered estates.
Meaning estates burdened by debt. Many of the old Anglo-Irish landlords were deeply in debt after the famine, with rent arrears piling up. This act essentially streamlined the process for selling off these indebted estates. It created clean land titles, making them attractive for quick sale.
Who bought them?
A new wave of landlords swept in, often speculative buyers, including English entrepreneurs, banks, insurance companies, and also, as Marx noted, a mass of previously enriched middlemen who now had the capital to become primary landowners themselves.
And these new owners?
They had bought the land, often cheaply, purely as a financial investment. They have little connection to the place or the people. Their goal was maximum rapid return, so they imposed even more severe rental regimes and intensified the eviction process even further. Marx said this act hastened the process of land clearance, basically providing fresh capital and legal cover for the ongoing campaign of depopulation.
So how are these clearances actually carried out? You mentioned evictions, but what did that look like?
It was brutal. Marx describes eviction en masse, forcible ejections carried out by landlord agents, bailiffs, often backed by police or military, and using gangs known chillingly as crowbar brigades.
Crowbar brigades.
Yes, because the process often began literally by using crowbars to demolish the roof of the tenant's cabin, making it immediately uninhabitable, driving the family out, often with nowhere to go.
Just tearing their homes down.
Yeah, systematically. Marx stressed how unprecedented this was. In no other European country did foreign rule adopt this form of direct expropriation of the stock population. It wasn't just about removing tenants. It was about erasing their presence from the landscape.
And the state was involved.
Undeniably, explicitly. Land agents directed these operations, protected, as Marx noted, by a large force of police and soldiery. He quotes a Galway newspaper from 1852 painting this grim picture. The sun that rose on a village sets on a desert.
A desert.
Marx didn't mince words. He called the state the tool of the landlords, directly implicating the British government and its forces in facilitating this systematic brutality, a state-sanctioned war against its own, well, its colonial subjects.
And the cottiers, the poorest, the ones most reliant on those tiny plots, they were the main target.
Absolutely, the explicit target. Marx observed with, you can feel the anger and sadness, the landlords of Ireland are confederated for a fiendish war of extermination against the cottiers. The small native tenants are disposed of with no more ado than vermin.
Like vermin.
Horrific language, but it reflects the dehumanization that was happening. They weren't just evicted, they were systematically banished from the countryside. Their huts, their homes, however humble, were swept away, often burned, completely erased.
What happened to the people who survived, who weren't able to emigrate?
The consequences were dire, immediately visible. They were forced to flood into the towns and cities, Dublin, Cork, Belfast, seeking refuge in, as Marx described it, the garrets, holes, cellars, and corners of urban Ireland.
Becoming an urban underclass.
Yes, and forming this desperate pool of agricultural wage laborers. They'd have to trek long distances back out to the countryside each day or seasonally to work on the newly consolidated larger farms, often for pitiful wages.
And Marx saw a difference here compared to England.
A crucial, ironic difference. In England, industrialization was booming. The factories drew their reserve army of labor, as Marx called it, from the surplus population displaced from the countryside. Industry absorbed them, albeit often under harsh conditions.
But in Ireland?
In purely agricultural Ireland, with its industries crushed, the agricultural reserve army of labor was ironically recruited from the pounds, where the evicted peasants had gathered. This just exacerbated urban poverty and squalor, depressed wages everywhere, and created untold misery. A completely inverted dynamic.
And this brings us right back to the ecology, doesn't it? The consequences of eliminating the cottier class.
Directly, tragically. Marx ties it straight back to his initial claim. The loss of the cottiers wasn't just a social catastrophe. It meant the loss of their specific, vital, ecologically sustaining labor.
Because they were the ones doing the intensive spade work, the manuring.
They were the ones, through their desperate ingenuity and back-breaking spade husbandry, who had kept the soil alive, who had counteracted the exhaustion, even under those terrible conditions.
So when they were removed.
Soil exhaustion intensified rapidly. There were no longer legions of spade tillers to pulverize the soil, break the iron pan, tirelessly gather manure, pare and burn earth up the potatoes. All those practices that had painstakingly maintained some level of fertility, they just ceased on a massive scale.
Is there evidence for this intensification of soil exhaustion?
Stark evidence. Marx points to the sudden decline in yields per acre of crops, which took place after the middle of the last century, right after the clearances peaked.
What kind of declines?
The figures are shocking. Between roughly 1847 and 1865, average yields of oats decreased by nearly 17%. Flax, a key crop, plummeted by almost 48%. And potatoes, unbelievably, the yield per acre fell by 50%.
50%?
Yes.
Even after the blight years?
Yes. And it wasn't just crop yields. Much of the land forcibly turned over to permanent pasture wasn't actually well suited for it. Without the careful cultivation and amendment it used to get, it rapidly degraded. It became covered in moss-like vegetation, as observers noted, and the stocking rates, the number of animals it could support, actually declined over time.
So even the shift to pasture wasn't as productive as hoped.
Not on this degraded land managed so poorly. It created this profound, heartbreaking paradox. Ireland, a country now almost purely agricultural, was becoming increasingly unable to feed its own drastically reduced population.
Unable to feed itself.
As a contemporary observer, Lyon Playfair calculated in 1870, looking back over the previous decade or so, in the 11 years, 1857-1868, Ireland has lost the power of feeding more than 1,800,000 of her population.
1.5 million people.
Ireland, once Britain's granary, was now forced to import basic foods like wheat, a direct, devastating result of this complex, destructive interplay of colonial policy, economic exploitation, and the resulting ecological degradation, a complete inversion of its potential.
Okay, let's just pause and step back for a moment to really appreciate Marx's deeper insights here, his dialectical lens, how it allowed him to connect all these threads.
Right, it lets him move beyond just describing events to creating these powerful analytical concepts.
Like rack-rented soil, that phrase really sticks.
It does, because it's not just descriptive, oh, the soil was rented and exhausted. It's analytical. It captures how the form of the rent, the social relationship of rack renting, actively expropriated the inherent sustainability of the Irish soil itself.
It shows how an abstract economic relationship had a direct physical impact on the material world, on the land's health.
Precisely. It links the social and the natural in a very concrete way.
And this connects to his comparison between Ireland and Britain and this idea of the incompleteness of capitalism in Ireland. Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yes, this is fascinating and deeply critical. Marx argued that Ireland suffered not just from the problems you'd expect with the development of capitalist production, exploitation, inequality, and so on, which were certainly present, but Ireland suffered perhaps even more tragically from capitalism's incompleteness there.
Incompleteness, meaning it didn't fully develop.
Right. It was distorted, stunted by the colonial relationship. Marx famously wrote, in a slightly different context, but it applies perfectly here. Alongside the modern evils, a whole series of inherited evils oppress us, arising from the passive survival of antiquated modes of production with their inevitable train of social and political anachronisms. We suffer not only from the living, but from the dead.
So applying that to Ireland.
Yeah.
Those rental forms, rack rent, conifer, they weren't just old feudal relics that hadn't died out yet.
Not simply that, no. Marx suggests they were a direct result of colonialism actively thwarting the natural development of a fully formed capitalist system in Ireland. It wasn't allowed to develop its own industries, its own internal market in the same way.
So it was like a hybrid monster.
In a way. It combined the worst exploitative elements of older pre-capitalist forms like arbitrary rent demands, absolute insecurity for the tenant, with the raw extractive logic of early capitalism focused on commodity export. But crucially, without the potentially modernizing aspects of capitalism like large-scale investment in productivity, technological innovation, or even the creation of a robust domestic market that might, in theory, have provided alternative livelihoods.
So it was a colonial hybrid designed purely for maximum extraction, minimum investment, minimum development within Ireland itself.
That's a very good summary of his argument. And this incompleteness, this distorted development is what generated such prolonged, intense suffering and trapped Ireland in this cycle of poverty and ecological ruin.
Which brings us to that grand paradox you mentioned earlier, the statistics that seem completely counterintuitive.
Right. Marx highlights this meticulously. The depopulation of Ireland has thrown much of the land out of cultivation, greatly diminished the produce of the soil. Nevertheless, the rents of the land and the profits of the farmers increased along with the fall in population.
Less food being grown, fewer people, more land idle, yet rents and profits for the landlords and big farmers went up. How does that even work?
It seems mad, doesn't it? But Marx explains how. The key was the consolidation of all those tiny small holdings into larger farms and the forced conversion from tillage, producing lots of low-value food like potatoes and some grain, feeding many people locally, to pasture, producing higher-value commodities like wool and meat for export.
So the type of production changed dramatically.
Dramatically. While the total amount of food, energy, or biomass produced by the land might have actually been smaller overall.
Less total stuff grown.
Yes, but a much larger proportion of what was grown became a surplus product available to the landlords and the large commercial farmers. Instead of that product being consumed as basic subsistence by millions of small tenants, it was now concentrated as valuable commodities like wool or cattle.
Commodities that fetched high prices on the English market.
Exactly. And crucially, the monetary value, the price of that surplus product meat, wool was increasing rapidly on the English market, especially after the Corn Laws repeal boosted livestock farming. So even if the land was yielding less overall, the value extracted by the landowners from that smaller, different product was going up.
So the land is being sterilized, producing less actual food for the people there. But the profits for the few are rising because they're exporting high-value goods.
That's the brutal logic Marx exposes. And he saw historical parallels, he noted. Hence, sterilization, gradual of land, as in Sicily by the ancient Romans, ditto in Egypt. He saw this pattern of colonial or imperial powers depleting the productive capacity of the lands they controlled for their own enrichment, regardless of the long-term consequences for the soil or the local population.
This really underscores his method, doesn't it? The science of interconnections, as he called it.
It absolutely does. His dialectical approach allowed him to reveal these hidden causal links between things that seem completely separate on the surface.
Like fluctuations in London meat prices and the actual physical sterilization of Irish soil.
Or a plant disease, the potato blight, and a specific system of political rule and land tenure. He didn't see these as coincidences or isolated events. He presented them as deeply interwoven, necessary consequences of this systematic, evolving colonial project, a project that deliberately exploited both people and the planet they lived on.
And this brings us right back full circle, doesn't it, to that initial provocative claim that started this whole deep dive.
It does. Through this incredibly detailed, interconnected analysis, Marx didn't just assert it, he felt he dialectically proved it. The potato blight resulted from soil exhaustion. It was a product of English rule.
He laid bare that intricate web, the social, economic, political forces that created the exact conditions, the vulnerability for a natural phenomenon like blight to become a human catastrophe on an unimaginable scale, where the land itself became a casualty of domination.
A powerful and sobering analysis.
So, just to recap our journey today, we've seen how British colonialism in Ireland, according to Marx, was this dynamic, ever-evolving process. Not static.
Constantly changing its strategies of oppression.
And this systematic subversion, it touched every single aspect of Irish society. The economy, social relations, culture, law.
The whole organic totality.
And this relentless process culminated not only in immense human suffering, but in the profound ecological degradation of Ireland's soil, directly contributing to the famine, shaping its devastating course and consequences.
Marx's analysis, I think, really forces us to look beyond those simple single-cause explanations for complex disasters, whether historical or even contemporary.
Yeah, it challenges us to see the hidden costs.
Exactly, the hidden ecological costs of political and economic domination. It reveals how power structures can quite literally reshape the natural environment, often to its detriment, and especially to the detriment of those who depend most directly upon it for their survival.
So as you, listening, reflect on this historical analysis by Marx, it really prompts a vital and maybe quite sobering question for our own time.
Which is?
Where else might we find colonized soil in the world today, past or present, if we applied this same interconnected lens, looking at how political and economic systems impact the environment?
How might contemporary global structures, trade patterns, power imbalances, how might they be impacting the health of our planet and its populations in ways that aren't immediately obvious?
Creating similar kinds of ecological rifts, maybe subtle, maybe overt.
It's a thought that definitely challenges us to look deeper, doesn't it? To try and understand the complex systems that shape our world and to recognize the very long shadows that can be cast by historical power and exploitation.
A lot to think about there.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yes, thank you everyone. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and stay curious.